the rules are there, but they're all self-policed, right? Where board games have rules, video games have laws, right? You cannot break the law of a video game. It is one of the fundamental differences between video games and other types of games and sports, is that there are laws, like I said, and I think if you think about the difference between the FGC and the Smash community, right? I think a large majority of the difference in culture between FGC and Smash comes down to laws versus rules. Smash is a game and in a competitive format has so many rules placed on it outside of the bounds of the game. Whereas fighting game, the FGC, typically just abides by the internal laws of the game. Even when Smash allows you to do things by law, oftentimes there will be rulings against it. Flaming out, timing out, like stage counter picks and stuff like that. There are all these factors that are self-imposed rules, and they live within that world. And I think it allows the community to make decisions which are fundamentally different than what the FGC does. And I think that's the big point of contention, or the big point of difference between those two groups. Oh yes, and this is not to say, yeah, Mohas, you're right. There are things where, like, turbo versus normal speeds. There are toggles within fighting games and FGC centric games which allow you to do that stuff, and the like community consensus that happens there is a fascinating process. Like, how did we decide what the definitive version of a game is? Why arcade Street Fighter the movie versus Sega Saturn Street Fighter the movie, right? And we have seen, I think, some of the biggest like points of contention within FGC culture historically have been around those things. Is it gonna be Dreamcast Marvel 2, or is it gonna be arcade Marvel 2? The shift from arcades to consoles as primary competitive formats was one of those things. And that was one of those things that we weren't abiding by the laws of the game anymore. We had two different versions of the same game which had different laws. So we had to choose which one we wanted to take part in. And it led to a big like rift within the community, and not large enough to split the community outright like it has with FGC and Smash. Yeah, and that's why Kao's saying that's not why they're a fan of Smash as like a competitive fight. There's a core difference in values that fighting game, the FGC and the Smash community have. And I at the core of it, it really is like law versus rules. The fighting game community, I think, is more geared towards the systems, interestingly enough, and the Smash community more towards the experience, right? And so the idea of laming out is bad for the experience, we're going to make rules against it. Stages are too random, or items are too random, so we're going to make rulings against them, or to mitigate that, right? It's about the experience as opposed to the systems. Using handicaps to nerf top tiers and make them viable and competitive, that's something we can do. And I think when we start using the tools at our disposal within the games, working within the laws of our games, that people are much more likely, within the FGC, are much more likely to engage with it in good faith. But we do end up in these situations where there are rulings that we have to make, right? Akuma is in Super Turbo. He's still banned for tournament play. We had to make a rule and adjudicate it and come to a community consensus. And we have, but like, there are some very, very obvious examples of when that kind of adjudication needs to happen in the FGC. And then some less obvious examples people don't really talk about as much because it's a little less comfortable talking about it in a way that we can all agree on. Yeah, fighting game players have historically always tried to play the default game when possible. I would agree with that. Smash players, custom rule sets from the get. Yeah, yeah. And that is, like I said, it is one of the things that has, you know, come up over the years and has turned into one of the core differences between them. Yeah, Eternal Champions is the Wild West of settings. It's also the Wild West of fighting games, which makes me wonder sometimes, is there a certain set of laws that we can implement for Eternal Champions to make the game more competitively viable? Because I think default probably doesn't work. But there might be a format within those settings that actually makes a lot of sense. Oh, dude, I forgot about that. KO pointing out when Pokken first came to console, due to the nature of it being a Nintendo game, Smash players tried to dictate rules by removing assist Pokemons, since Smash didn't allow assist trophies. That is fascinating, especially since Pokken comes from a Tekken background. That like, can you do that? Like, whose game is this, right? Like, who makes that call at that point? That is a really interesting, like, cross-section of the Venn diagram of Smash players and FGC players. And that's a really interesting case study. But the Pokken scene fought back, kept the assist in Pokemon, calling it a core part of the game, citing Pokken Arcade scene as the biggest contributor. I love it. But that is a really fascinating instance of like two different sets, community values from two distinct portions of the community who are likely to play these games, like coming into contact with each other. Warthog, that is phenomenal. Memorizing the transition times on Smash stages and using them to actually effectively do combos. That is one of the things that, like, for me as a competitive player, what interests me about Smash is that variability, is the ability to adapt to the constantly changing scenarios, which is why I think randomness is a core part of Smash, man. Let it be, right? And I think I would personally enjoy the game a lot more competitively if that stuff was left open, if there were more random stages with more stage hazards, right? Once again, there are rules that you can put into, like, different levels of randomness and different, like, frequency of items. I would be more comfortable as a fighting game community member engaging with a competitive game that played within those laws, as opposed to turning them all off and then adding in extra structures. But like, that's really cool. Like, using those stage transitions is really cool. And there are so many more stages in Smash that you could do really cool and interesting things with from a competitive player perspective that are just like, no, you're not allowed.